Rain fell over the city like a sentence no one wanted to hear, not a storm, just a relentless, whispering rain that turned light into mist and washed the asphalt in silver reflections. The night carried the kind of silence that lives beneath traffic noise, the hum of electricity, the far-off sirens that belong to another world. Leonardo Valeni sat in the back seat of a black Maserati idling beneath the crooked sign of a half-empty bar. The glow from the streetlight above flickered against the tinted glass, stuttering like a heartbeat that couldn't decide whether to stop. Inside, he looked calm. Too calm for a man whose name was whispered in police briefings and muttered in the streets like a prayer and a warning at once. He was in his 40s, but life in the shadows had carved years deeper than any clock could count. His suit was tailored perfectly, but the cuffs were damp. His eyes were steady, unreadable, the color of wet concrete. There was a scar under his jawline, thin as a whisper, a mark from a bullet that never found its home. He wasn't waiting for anyone in particular that night. He told himself he came here for quiet, for a drink in a place where no one would say his name. But even he didn't believe that. Men like Leonardo didn't go anywhere without a reason. Even when they claimed they just wanted peace, peace came wrapped in some kind of violence. Inside the bar, an old radio murmured a love song that had long lost its sweetness. Behind the counter, a young woman wiped glasses and tried not to meet his eyes each time she glanced his way. Her name was Clara, 26, working double shifts between law school applications, rent, and a younger brother who still believed heroes wore uniforms. Her hair was tied loosely, strands falling against her cheek whenever she leaned forward. She didn't know who he was, not really. Just another man who tipped too much, spoke too little, and carried silence like it was gold. But that night, silence broke. The door burst open with a sudden violence that startled the jukebox into skipping. Two men stormed in, masks, wet jackets, trembling hands. They weren't professionals. Leonardo could smell desperation before the guns even lifted. Clara froze. The bartender raised his hands. The taller man shouted for money, voice cracking under fear. The other one shook, aiming at shadows that didn't move. Leonardo didn't stand right away. He studied them, noting the uncut fingernails, the uneven breathing, the cheap pistol that looked borrowed. The wrong kind of criminals, he thought. Men who stumbled into sin because they couldn't afford anything else. When the shaking man pointed the gun at Clara, something in Leonardo's chest, something he thought had died years ago, stirred. Not mercy, not anger, just a memory, quiet and sharp, of another young woman who had once stood behind a counter, back when his hands were still clean. He moved before thought could stop him, a blur. A sound like thunder caught in a bottle point. One of the robbers went down hard, his wrist twisted, the gun sliding under a stool. The other tried to fire, but Leonardo was already too close. A single blow to the chest sent him crashing into the jukebox, the song stuttering into silence. When it was over, the bar smelled of fear and sweat and rain. Clara stood frozen, her breathing jagged. Leonardo turned to her slowly, his voice low but even. "Call the police," he said. She hesitated. There was something in his tone, not a request, not an order, but the quiet certainty of a man used to being obeyed. She nodded, reaching for the phone. He didn't wait for gratitude. As she called, he picked up his coat, left a bill on the counter, far too much, and stepped back into the rain. The Maserati's headlights cut a line through the wet darkness. Within moments, he was gone. When the police arrived, they found two injured men and a shaken woman who couldn't explain the stranger who saved her. She described him as calm, tall, with eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. They ran the CCTV later, but the footage was a blur. A ghost in a suit, a car with plates that led nowhere. That night should have ended there, but fate, or maybe guilt, never leaves things half done. The following morning, Leonardo couldn't shake the sound of her voice, the way it trembled yet didn't break. He sat in his office, a glass building that looked down on the city like a crown made of mirrors. On the surface, it was a logistics company, freight, shipping, storage. Below that surface, it was something older, darker, older than laws, sustained by debts, silence, and blood. Santo, his consigliere, entered without knocking. "They found out who the men were," he said, placing a file on the table. "Small-time junkies. Tried to rob a corner store last week too. One's in the hospital." Leonardo didn't look up. He was staring at the rain streaking the glass. "Did anyone trace them back to us?"
No.
"Why would they?" Santos smirked. "You were just having a drink, boss." "Right," Leonardo murmured. "Just a drink." But his thoughts weren't on the men. They were on her, the waitress with eyes that didn't beg for mercy or money, just a chance to survive another night. He told himself it was nothing. Still, he sent someone to check on her. He didn't know why. Maybe to make sure she was safe. Maybe to silence something inside him that whispered of debts unpaid. 3 days later, Clara received an envelope at her apartment door. No name, no address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Your tuition has been paid. Focus on your future." No signature. She stared at it for a long time, heart pounding. She didn't tell anyone, not even her brother. She thought about the stranger's eyes, the way he moved, the quiet command in his voice. She wondered what kind of man fought like that, disappeared like that, and then sent money without asking for anything in return. It should have frightened her. But instead, it left her with a strange calm, the kind that comes when you realize the world isn't only cruel, it's complicated. Years passed. Leonardo Valeni's empire grew quieter, more legitimate on paper, more dangerous beneath. He learned to manage the peace the way soldiers manage their scars, with patience and the acceptance that some wounds never close. Clara, now 29, walked into the courthouse wearing a gray suit that didn't hide her nerves. She was the youngest prosecutor in her district, newly assigned to a high-profile case involving a network of shell companies suspected of laundering money for the Valeni Group. The name made her stomach twist, not because she feared it, but because it felt like déjà vu. She couldn't explain why, but somewhere deep in her mind, the sound of it echoed like rain against glass. When she opened the file and saw the photo, Leonardo Valeni, age 47, her breath caught. The same eyes, the same calm. The man from that night, the one who saved her life. Her hands trembled. The paper whispered as it slid between her fingers. She told herself it couldn't be the same man.
People change.
Memory lies, but the scar under his jaw, faint, precise, proved memory was right. And just like that, justice became personal. The photo sat on her desk long after the rest of the office lights had gone dark. Through the window, she could see the courthouse plaza gleaming with puddles, the same city that had raised her and tried to break her in the same breath. Somewhere out there, he was still moving, older now, hidden behind legitimate fronts, but alive. A ghost in a tailored suit. She had built her entire career on believing that law could clean what blood had stained. But now the line between gratitude and duty blurred until it hurt to look at. Clara closed the file, slipped it into her briefcase, and tried to leave the building before the memory of that night followed her out. On the courthouse steps the rain began again, soft at first, then steady. She didn't open her umbrella. She let it soak into her hair, her suit, her doubts. Maybe the rain could wash away the question whispering at the edge of every heartbeat. How do you prosecute the man who once saved your life? Across the city, Leonardo sat in a dim room where light came only from the aquarium that lined the wall behind his desk. Silver fish moved like thoughts, slow, silent, restless. Santo poured 2 drinks and placed one beside him, the new prosecutor assigned to the financial case, Clara Mendez. Santo said her name the way men mention a rumor. Young, sharp, ambitious. They say she doesn't scare easy. Leonardo lifted the glass but didn't drink. You checked her background?
Clean.
Almost too clean. He finally drank, eyes on the fish. Let her dig. She won't find anything we don't let her find. Santo hesitated. You sure about that? The network isn't what it used to be. Some of the old guard. I said. Leonardo interrupted softly. Let her dig. The older man nodded and left, shutting the door behind him. The silence returned, thick and living. Leonardo leaned back, the taste of whiskey burning the edge of his throat. He hadn't heard that name in years, but the moment Sano spoke it, the bar, the rain, and the girl's trembling hands came back as if no time had passed. He told himself it was coincidence. The world was small, smaller for men like him. But a voice somewhere deep inside whispered that nothing in his life had ever been coincidence. Clara spent nights buried in files. The Valeni group looked solid on the surface. Contracts, shipping records, tax returns, all in order. But the deeper she went, the more she saw patterns that didn't belong. Transfers to shell companies that existed only on paper, charitable donations that circled back into private accounts. It was like trying to trace smoke. The more she worked, the more the image of him haunted her. She remembered the precision of his movement, the stillness after violence. No panic, no hesitation. A man like that didn't just vanish into legitimacy. He adapted. At 3 in the morning, she pushed the papers away and stared at the ceiling. The rain outside tapped against the window in the same rhythm as that night years ago. She realized then that she wasn't just chasing a criminal. She was chasing the truth about the one moment that had defined her life without her consent. Leonardo's world began to shift. Small things first. An accountant went missing. A warehouse was raided. One of his captains arrested on minor charges that somehow stuck. None of it threatened him directly, but together they formed a pattern he couldn't ignore. Someone was pulling at threads that led back to him. He gathered his inner circle one evening in the back room of an old restaurant. The smell of wine and leather hung in the air. He listened while they argued about loyalty, about strategy, about who could be trusted. When they were done, he said quietly, "The enemy isn't outside. It's inside. Find where the leak begins." The room fell silent. Everyone knew what he meant. Inside meant family, and family meant blood. That night, when the others left, he remained alone, tracing his finger along the rim of his glass. For the first time in years, he felt the shape of exhaustion. He had built everything to escape chaos, to control it. But control was a myth. Sooner or later, everything you bury comes back, wearing another face. Clara's first direct encounter with him happened 2 weeks later. She was walking to her car after a late meeting when headlights flared against the parking lot wall. A man stepped out of the shadows, umbrella tilted against the drizzle. She froze until she saw who it was. He looked exactly as she remembered, only older, heavier in the eyes. The rain made his coat shimmer darkly. For a long moment neither spoke. Then he said, almost gently, "You shouldn't be alone this late, Miss Mendez." The sound of his voice made her chest tighten. "You know my name. I make it my business to know who's interested in me." She tried to keep her tone steady. "Then you also know I'm doing my job." "I respect that," he said. "Just be careful what you dig up. Sometimes truth doesn't set you free. It buries you." He stepped past her, into the rain, and was gone before she could find a single word to stop him. She stood there, heart racing, watching the taillights disappear. Part of her wanted to run after him, to demand answers. Another part wanted to forget he existed. But she knew the moment she saw his eyes again that forgetting was no longer an option. Later that night she sat in her apartment, replaying the encounter. The way he said her name. The calm certainty in his warning. She told herself he was trying to intimidate her, to throw her off. But somewhere beneath that thought was something more dangerous. She didn't feel fear. She felt empathy. She remembered how he had looked that night in the bar, not cruel, not angry, just resolute. Maybe he had saved her because he couldn't stand to see another innocent fall. Maybe that was his last good deed before surrendering to darkness. Or maybe, she feared, there was still good left in him. She rubbed her temples, whispering to herself, "He's a criminal, Clara, not a savior." But the words rang hollow. In his penthouse, Leonardo watched the city from the balcony, cigarette smoke curling through the night. The rain had stopped, but the streets still glistened, and the sound of distant traffic echoed like memory. He thought of her eyes, how time had hardened them, yet left a trace of the same light. He wondered if she would hate him when she learned the truth about what he had done for her after that night. The tuition, the quiet protection. The things he had done without ever asking for recognition. He told himself it didn't matter. But when he closed his eyes, her voice filled the silence again. The sound of her calling the police. Trembling, yet steady. The moment his hand brushed hers as he placed the money on the counter. For the first time in years, Leonardo Moretti felt something dangerously close to regret. Morning crept over the city in pale shades of gray, soft as cigarette smoke. The skyline looked tired, the river below moving like a thought that refused to settle. Somewhere beneath that tired light, two people woke up thinking of each other for reasons they couldn't justify. Clara stirred first. The alarm buzzed, the coffee percolated, the apartment smelled faintly of rain carried in through the open window. Her brother had already left for work, leaving a note that said, "Stay safe, sis. Don't forget to eat." She smiled faintly, folded the note, and placed it beside the growing pile of case files stacked on her kitchen table. Each folder was a thread. Together they formed a web that spelled one name again and again. Moretti Group Holdings. She flipped one open as she sipped her coffee. Transfers from Monaco. Contracts in Dubai. Real estate shells in Florence. Everything clean on paper, yet the numbers curved back on themselves like a serpent swallowing its tail. Her phone buzzed. A message from her senior colleague. Meeting with Finance Division at 10. Bring what you have on the Moretti accounts. She typed back on my way and closed the folder. Before leaving, she paused at the door, looking once more at the photo of Leonardo clipped to the front page. His eyes followed her like unfinished business. At the same hour, Leonardo stood in a private gym, overlooking the harbor. He wasn't training, just standing there in silence, watching the movement of ships below, the cranes lifting containers like toys. The world kept moving, but he felt the slow drag of time in his bones. Santo entered, carrying a tablet. "We traced the leak," he said quietly. "One of our accountants was feeding information to an investigator in the district attorney's office." Leonardo didn't turn. "Alive. For now."
Keep him that way.
"I want to know what he told them." Santo hesitated. "You think this prosecutor, Clara, is behind it?" Leonardo finally turned, towel slung around his shoulders. "She's doing her job. Others are doing mine badly." He walked to the window again, looking at the gray horizon. "Clean it up, Santo. No blood unless I say." Santo nodded and left. Leonardo pressed his palm to the glass, the cold seeping into his skin. For years, he had prided himself on discipline, never acting out of emotion, never letting the ghosts of the past steer his hand. But lately, the line between instinct and memory blurred. Every decision carried her face in its shadow. Clara spent the morning in conference rooms that smelled of stale coffee and fluorescent lights. Lawyers argued over spreadsheets, investigators talked about subpoenas, but her mind was elsewhere. When one of them mentioned a lead inside Moretti's accounting department, she straightened in her seat. "How solid is it?" she asked. The investigator shrugged. "Anonymous tip. Said they can prove money laundering if we can protect their identity." Clara's pulse quickened. "Then we protect it. Get them whatever they need." The meeting moved on, but she felt the first tremor of danger, the knowledge that the wall between her and Leonardo was thinning. If the leak was real, he would know soon. And when he knew, someone would pay. That evening she walked home instead of taking a cab. The city after rain had a strange beauty. Neon lights smeared across puddles, reflections of people who never looked up. She needed the air, the movement, the illusion that she could walk away from the weight of what she was uncovering. At an intersection, she paused to buy a paper from a vendor. The headline caught her eye. "Businessman donates millions to youth rehabilitation fund." The photo beneath it was Leonardo, smiling faintly beside a row of politicians. The caption called him philanthropist. Her stomach twisted. He had built an empire on fear, and now he was rewriting it with charity. She thought of the envelope that had paid her tuition years ago, the line that said "Focus on your future." Maybe this was his way of paying debts he couldn't name. She folded the paper under her arm and kept walking. That night, Leonardo dined alone in his penthouse. The table was set for two out of habit, but the other seat remained empty. Across from him, the city shimmered through floor-to-ceiling windows, each light a tiny pulse of life he could never touch. He ate slowly, barely tasting the food. Memories moved through him like slow music. The first deal he ever made, the first time he drew a gun, the first life he took and the silence that followed. He remembered a promise he'd made to his mother long ago: never become the man who killed your father. He had broken it in every possible way. When the dishes were cleared, he poured himself another drink and walked to his study. On his desk lay a folder marked with her name. Santo had left it earlier. Inside were photos: Clara leaving her office, Clara at her apartment door, Clara walking through the rain with files clutched to her chest. He stared at them for a long time, then slid them into a drawer. "Enough," he whispered. "No more watching." But he didn't throw them away. Days turned into weeks. The investigation tightened. Clara's team secured warrants, and each new document pulled another thread from Valenti's web. It was subtle work, too subtle for headlines, but the ripples reached him all the same. When another of his accountants disappeared, Leonardo called Santo and said, "It's time we talk to the girl directly." Santo frowned. "That's dangerous." "So is silence," Leonardo said. "Arrange something quiet, somewhere neutral." 2 nights later, Clara received an unmarked envelope at her office. Inside was a single line written in precise handwriting: Pier 9. Midnight.
Come alone.
The truth deserves a face. She stared at it, pulse quickening. It could be a trap. It probably was. But she couldn't ignore it. She told herself she'd only go to observe, not to engage. When she arrived, the pier was half-lit by the glow of distant cranes. The air smelled of salt and oil. A single black car waited at the edge of the dock. Leonardo stood beside it, coat collar turned up against the wind. "You came," he said quietly. "I had to know why," she answered. "Why contact me?" He looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "Because lies have a way of turning into truths when you don't face them. I don't want that for either of us." "You think this conversation will change anything?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But I owe you honesty." They stood there, the sea muttering below, both aware that somewhere in the darkness, men were watching to make sure nothing went wrong. For the first time, she saw not the myth but the man, the lines at his eyes, the fatigue beneath control. "You saved my life once," she said. "Was that guilt?" He shook his head. "Instinct. Maybe decency. I don't remember which came first." "Then why the money? Why the tuition?" He smiled faintly. "Because you reminded me what it felt like to believe in something pure. I wanted to keep that alive, even if I couldn't touch it." Silence. The wind carried the taste of rain. She should have arrested him right there, called for backup, ended the game. But she didn't move. Something in his tone, resigned, weary, held her still. Finally, he said, "You'll do what you have to. Just remember, not all debts are paid in court." He stepped back into the car, door closing softly. The engine hummed, the lights turned, and the vehicle slid into the darkness, leaving her alone on the dock with the echo of waves and the weight of a truth she hadn't wanted. Later that night, she wrote her report but couldn't finish it. Every sentence felt false. The system wanted criminals and victims, clean categories. What she'd seen didn't fit either. She closed her laptop and sat in silence until dawn broke over the city, pale and tired. Across town, Leonardo met Santo again. "She came," he said. Santo studied him. "And she won't stop. But she'll understand." "Understand what?" "That monsters are made, not born." He turned toward the window where morning light crawled across the glass, softer than forgiveness, harsher than peace. The days that followed moved like the slow tightening of a noose. The investigation accelerated. Subpoenas reached his front companies. Accounts froze. Inside the Valenti group, panic began to bloom. Santo pushed for retaliation, but Leonardo held him back. "Let them think they're winning," he said. "It'll show us who runs when the fire starts." He didn't mention Clara again, but her presence filled every quiet space in his thoughts. In a world built on control, she had become the one thing he couldn't contain. The city woke in gray. Traffic hummed through the mist like distant machinery, and the smell of wet concrete clung to the air. Leonardo sat by the window of his office, watching the drizzle slide down the glass. In front of him, the empire he'd built stretched far below: clubs, docks, warehouses, every corner where loyalty was paid in silence. Yet that morning, the view felt different. He couldn't shake the image of the girl he'd pulled from the burning street months ago, the one with trembling hands and a voice that still echoed in his mind. He didn't know her name. He'd made sure not to. Saving her had been an impulse, something human he wasn't supposed to have anymore. But since that night, every quiet moment turned back to her face. It was as if the fire had left a mark on him too. Down in the district courthouse, Clara Alvarez moved through corridors stacked with case files taller than her shoulders. She'd earned her place as an assistant prosecutor through sleepless nights and bitter coffee, but her body still carried faint scars from that night on Belmont Street. When the explosion tore through the alley, a stranger had dragged her out from the wreckage. She never saw his face clearly, but she remembered his voice, deep, steady, commanding. She'd spent weeks wondering who he was, until the need to survive buried the thought beneath her work. That day, her boss dropped a new case file on her desk. "Corruption in the dock authority," he said. "Word is, the syndicates are washing money through the unions. I want every paper, every name." She flipped the folder open and saw a logo stamped on the bottom of one invoice. Varelli Imports. Her pulse stuttered. She'd seen that name before, in whispers and rumors. Leonardo Varelli, industrial magnate, philanthropist, and, according to street talk, the man who owned half the city's shadows. For the rest of the afternoon, Clara couldn't focus. The more she read, the more the lines blurred between law and the world beyond it. She wasn't naive. She knew justice was an illusion in a city like this. But something about this case felt personal, as if she were being drawn into the same current that had almost drowned her once. That night, rain returned. Leonardo left his penthouse for the docks, his coat whipping in the wind. The shipment from Palermo was due, and he never trusted anyone else to inspect the first container. Beneath the sodium lights, men worked in silence, their movements sharp and efficient. One of them, a tall, nervous figure, kept glancing over his shoulder. Leonardo noticed. He always noticed. "Luca," he called. The man froze. "Boss, you're sweating like it's summer. Something on your mind?" Luca stammered something about the paperwork, about the customs seal, but Leonardo already saw the life forming in his eyes. He signaled quietly to his right-hand man, Marco, who stepped forward and took Luca by the arm. Minutes later, a confession spilled out under the echoing sound of waves slapping against steel. Luca had been paid by a rival to switch containers. Leonardo said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Clean it up. Make it look like an accident." As the men moved, Leonardo turned toward the sea. The skyline shimmered faintly across the water, 1,000 windows glowing like distant promises. He felt the weight of every decision pressing down, how mercy and violence lived so close together in him now. And another part of the city. Clara sat alone in her apartment, files spread across the table. Rain tapped to the windows. She had traced another invoice to a subsidiary connected to Varelli Imports. Her pen paused. The name sparked something in her, a strange, restless curiosity. She opened her laptop and began digging deeper into charity records, real estate holdings, anything public. The more she found, the clearer the pattern became. Leonardo Varelli's empire wasn't just business. It was architecture built on blood, disguised as commerce. And yet, in one photo of him accepting an award, she felt something that unsettled her. His eyes didn't look like a predator's. They looked haunted. That night, as she fell asleep over her papers, the dream came again. The fire, the heat, the voice that told her to hold on. Only this time, when she turned toward the shadow pulling her from the wreckage, she saw his face, Leonardo's. She woke trembling, heart racing, unsure if the dream was memory or imagination. The next morning, Leonardo attended a meeting at one of his hotels. A charity gala was approaching, the kind the city loved. Photographers, champagne, promises of hope. For Leonardo, these events were shields, reminders to the public that he was a benefactor, not a crime lord. But when his assistant handed him the guest list, his gaze stopped on a single name, Clara Alvarez, assistant district prosecutor. He leaned back in his chair, reading it again, The city wasn't done weaving its threads. Marco noticed his silence. Something wrong, boss? Leonardo folded the paper slowly.
No.
Just interesting. That evening, the ballroom glowed with golden light. Crystal chandeliers swayed above a crowd of the city's elite. Reporters swarmed the entrance, their flashes painting momentary storms of white. Clara entered in a simple black dress, her badge tucked discreetly in her clutch. She felt out of place among the silk and laughter. But this was part of her job. Networking, reading faces, collecting whispers. Still, when her gaze drifted toward the far end of the room, the noise around her faded. Leonardo Moretti stood near the bar, a glass of whiskey in hand, speaking to the mayor. He was taller than she remembered from photographs, his presence commanding without effort. The tailored suit couldn't hide the scars on his knuckles, faint reminders of another life beneath the polish. Their eyes met across the room, neither moved, neither smiled, but something electric passed between them, a recognition deeper than logic. She turned away first, pretending to examine a display of auction items. But her pulse betrayed her calm. Behind her, Leonardo's gaze followed, the faintest trace of confusion on his face. He'd looked at thousands of people over the years, but something about her presence pulled at the corner of his mind like a forgotten dream. Later, as the night wound down, Clara slipped onto the balcony for air. The city sprawled below, lights flickering like dying stars. The rain had stopped, leaving everything slick and nude. A quiet voice broke the silence. Long night?
She turned.
Leonardo stood beside her, the faintest smile on his lips. For a moment, neither spoke. The world held its breath. The morning after the gala, the city felt quieter than usual, as if the night had stolen something from both of them. Leonardo sat in his office, the scent of last night's whiskey still lingering on his fingertips. The image of Clara Alvarez haunted him, the curve of her expression, the restraint in her eyes. There had been recognition there, though neither of them could explain it. He didn't believe in fate, but that encounter unsettled the discipline he'd built around his heart. The world of business and blood was supposed to be clean-cut. Loyalty, control, silence. Yet since that night, his mind strayed. Every plan he made, every order he gave, seemed to echo her voice, the one that once cried in firelight, the one that made him feel something close to guilt. Across the city, Clara returned to her desk with sleepless eyes and a heavy chest. The files in front of her no longer looked like paper and ink. They looked like pieces of a puzzle that had waited years for her to see the full picture. Every road she followed, every signature she traced, led her back to one man, Leonardo Moretti, and with each new connection, she found herself torn between duty and something she couldn't name. The memory of his face last night wasn't the same as the man in her case files. It wasn't the cold legend built from crime and influence. It was a man who looked tired, almost lonely, but justice wasn't built on feelings. She hardened her resolve and began building her case. Leonardo, meanwhile, faced a different kind of storm. Inside his empire, cracks were starting to appear. His consigliere, Marco, had begun questioning decisions quietly. Nothing overt, but enough for Leonardo to notice the change in tone during briefings. There were whispers about a new alliance forming between two rival families, and worse, someone inside Moretti Imports was leaking information. He didn't show it, but it gnawed at him. Power built on fear was fragile, and Leonardo had always preferred control to chaos. That afternoon, he gathered his lieutenants in the old wine cellar beneath the hotel, the same place his father once planned the early operations that built the family's fortune. When the door closed, he looked at them one by one, eyes calm, voice steady. "Someone's been feeding the cops and the courts," he said. "I want names. I want proof. And I want loyalty. You give me that, and no one here needs to worry about survival." The silence that followed was thick with tension. They all knew what betrayal meant in his world, but loyalty, once broken, rarely healed. Later that night, Leonardo drove alone through the rain. He didn't trust his men to protect what mattered anymore, and though he couldn't say why, he found himself outside the courthouse district, parked beneath a flickering streetlight. Through the windshield, he saw her leaving the building, files pressed against her chest. coat pulled tight against the wind. He didn't approach. He just watched, the way she moved, the way her eyes darted around as if searching for answers she couldn't find. And when she disappeared into the mist, he started his car again, wondering when he'd stopped recognizing the man in his own reflection. Weeks passed. The case grew heavier on Clara's shoulders. She worked late into the night, tracing offshore accounts, interviewing witnesses too afraid to talk. Each new piece of evidence pointed closer to Leonardo's organization, but her emotions betrayed her resolve. Sometimes she'd catch herself defending him in her thoughts, imagining reasons behind his crimes, stories that made him human instead of monstrous. And every time she did, she'd close her eyes and whisper that single reminder, "You owe justice to the truth, not your heart." But the truth, she was learning, was a complicated thing. One evening, she returned home to find an unmarked envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a single photograph, her walking home from the courthouse, and a note written in precise, elegant handwriting. "Be careful who you trust," her breath caught. It wasn't a threat. It felt like a warning, and though she didn't want to believe it, she knew who it came from. That same night, Leonardo met Marco in the warehouse by the river. He'd been informed of the leak, a name, a detail, a single trail of blood that led to betrayal within his circle. When Marco arrived, Leonardo watched him carefully. The man had been at his side for 15 years, through the wars, through the rebuilding. But tonight his posture was different, cautious, defensive. "You've been quiet lately," Leonardo said. "Just thinking," Marco replied. "About the way things are changing." "Changing how?" "Too many eyes on us. Too many hands in the dark. Maybe it's time to step back." Leonardo's jaw tightened. "You think I can step back? You think this city forgets who built it?" Marco met his gaze, voice low. "I think it's already forgetting. And maybe that's not such a bad thing." The silence that followed was thick, painful. Leonardo looked at him, and for the first time in years, he saw the truth. Marco wasn't just tired. He was done by the end of the night. Marco was gone, and one found his body. No one asked questions, but the loss carved something hollow inside Leonardo's chest that no amount of control could fill. Days blurred. Clara's investigation pushed deeper, and Leonardo's world grew colder. The distance between them, the prosecutor and the criminal, became both a wall and a bridge. Then came the subpoena point. One of Leonardo's shell companies was officially under federal scrutiny. The news broke across the morning papers, his name whispered in every boardroom and courtroom in the city. For the first time in years, Leonardo Moretti was being hunted legally. He read the headline at breakfast, his hands perfectly still, his expression unreadable. He knew this wasn't coincidence. Someone had connected the dots too quickly, too perfectly. Someone inside the courthouse wanted him exposed. That afternoon, he arranged a quiet meeting. Not in a bar or an office, but in a small cafe on 3rd Avenue, the kind of place where no one looked twice at strangers. When Clara arrived, she didn't expect to see him sitting there. Her body went rigid, instinct screaming to leave, but his calm presence froze her. He gestured toward the empty chair. The conversation that followed was quiet, careful, not about confessions or threats, but about humanity. About how justice and survival blurred in a world built on debt and blood. He didn't defend his empire. He didn't deny it either. He simply said, "Everything you're trying to destroy, I built because someone once tried to destroy me." She left the cafe shaken, angry, confused. He remained, staring at the table, wondering why telling her even that much felt like a betrayal of himself. By autumn, everything began to crumble. The rival families moved against him. His assets froze. The press called him a ghost, a shadow slipping through the city's cracks, and Clara, trapped between law and conscience, watched his empire fall piece by piece. But beneath the ruin, something else was happening, something neither of them could stop. The more the city turned against Leonardo, the more Clara's heart began to see the man behind the crime, the one who saved her life without reason, the one who warned her when no one else would. And when he finally disappeared, vanished without trial or trace, she felt the weight of both loss and relief, because some part of her knew This wasn't the end of Leonardo Moretti. It was only the beginning of his reckoning. The morning came like a stranger, soft, hesitant, as if unsure whether the city of scars still deserved the light. Leonardo Moretti stood on the balcony of the hideout villa miles from Rome, the same one where he once planned blood and betrayal. Now the air carried no scent of gunpowder or expensive cigars, only the ocean wind and the faint laughter of his daughter playing somewhere behind him. For months, the world had believed him dead. The explosion at the docks had destroyed the old empire, scattering his men and burning the evidence of his rule. Yet, in that death, Leonardo had found something close to peace. He traded his suits for linen shirts, his guns for silence. And still, every night, the ghosts whispered. Clara appeared in the doorway, barefoot, her hair loose, sunlight spilling across her face. She wasn't the same woman who had once trembled in fear of the man before her. She was his anchor now, the only one who spoke to him without needing words. He turned toward her, eyes softer than they'd ever been. "I keep waiting to wake up," he murmured. "Like this is some dream I don't deserve." Clara walked closer, her fingers brushing the scar along his jaw, a mark from the night everything burned. "You do deserve it," she said. "You fought for it, even when it meant losing everything." He wanted to believe her, but in his chest, the memories still screamed. The men he'd killed, the families broken because of his orders. Redemption didn't wash away blood. It only taught you how to live with it. The peace didn't last. 3 days later, a car arrived at the edge of the villa road. No insignia, no threat, just a single envelope slid beneath the gate. Leonardo found it while feeding the chickens with his daughter. The handwriting on it froze him in place. "It's over, Leo. They found you. But there's a way." Marco de Santi, his most loyal lieutenant, the man who had sworn to vanish after the docks burned. That night, Leonardo sat alone by the old radio, reading the letter over and over. Marco had been caught by Interpol. But instead of betraying Leonardo's location, he'd made a deal: turn in the remaining evidence of the Moretti Empire, and Leonardo would be granted conditional immunity in exchange for testimony, a chance to walk free, a chance to clear his daughter's name from every record that bore his blood. Clara found him there in the dark, clutching the letter. "You can't," she said immediately, voice trembling. "If you go back, they'll kill you before the law ever sees you." Leonardo didn't answer right away. He stared at the fire, seeing the faces of men who died for him, some loyal, some not. "If I don't go back," he said slowly, "our daughter will grow up running from my shadow. I can't let that be her childhood." He looked up at her. "I built a kingdom out of blood. Now I have to bury it myself." Tears shimmered in Clara's eyes. She knew then that the man before her wasn't the boss the world remembered. He was a father. A man trying to trade vengeance for peace. Rome. 6 months later, the courtroom was silent when Leonardo Moretti entered, flanked by 2 guards. Cameras flashed. Whispers rose like a tide. The fallen king of Italy's underworld had come to face the law. Clara sat in the back, holding their daughter's small hand. She hadn't seen him for months. Only letters smuggled through lawyers, each one ending the same way. "If I come back to you, I'll be free. If I don't, promise me you'll keep the light alive." As Leonardo stood before the judge, the city held its breath. He confessed to everything: smuggling, money laundering, conspiracy, the murders he could no longer deny. But when the judge asked him why a man like him had chosen to surrender, Leonardo simply said, "Because my daughter deserves a father, not a legend." The courtroom went still. His sentence was lenient: 5 years under protection, community restitution, testimony to dismantle the remnants of his own empire. To some, it was mercy. To others, betrayal. But to Clara, it was salvation. 5 years later, the sea was calm again. A small house sat on a hill above Naples, where wildflowers climbed the fence and the laughter of a little girl echoed across the fields. Leonardo worked at the harbor now, repairing boats and teaching kids how to tie knots. His hands were still calloused, but the stains of his past had faded with time. One evening, as the sun bled gold into the horizon, Clara joined him on the porch. Their daughter, Sophia, ran down to the beach chasing a kite. You kept your promise, Clara whispered. Leonardo smiled faintly, eyes following the kite dancing in the sky. No, he said softly. You did. You kept the light alive. He turned to her, taking her hand. I'll spend the rest of my life earning this peace, Clara. Not because I have to, but because I want to. The wind stirred, carrying away the echoes of gunfire that had once haunted him. In their place came laughter. For the first time in years, Leonardo Moretti felt something pure, not victory, not power, just home.